Um, John Case is a veteran of the Navy. He was a navigator bombardier during the Vietnam War, right, John?
Yes.
And John is also a star hockey player, even to this very day. Just returned from the intensive hockey tournament in Santa Rosa, California, in the hockey rink built by good old, what's his name, Snoopy? Charles Schultz. Yeah, I can't remember names anymore, so everybody knows that, and you'll please excuse me. So John's real active, and he retired from his law practice a few years ago and got bored and decided, I really have to do something about election integrity, so I'm going to get involved, and he's been very involved. Today we're going to share with you some observations about the election system. It's a little technical. We'll try to make it interesting, but it's technical. I mean, we have an election system that most citizens are totally oblivious to. You don't know how it works. You get a ballot in the mail, and you fill it out and you mail it in, and that's usually, what you know about the election system. But there's a lot more to it, and we think many reasons to be concerned about it. We're not here to tell you that there's been any election fraud, although I personally am sure there has been in every election, because if you can do it, you'll do it. I mean, why did Willie Sutton rob the banks, right? Because that's where the money was. So anyone who can cheat will cheat, but we're not here about cheating, and we're not here about election fraud. We're here about the system to explain what it is, how it works, so you can be more informed as citizens, and if you have concerns about what you hear, maybe you can do something about it. Tomorrow, midday, we're going to have a small lunch for a few people who want to drill down a little more deeply on it, and if it's something that you have time to do and want to do, talk to me about it afterwards. So with that, I want to get started on Colorado election systems and explain to you what the systems are about and what aspects of the systems we think are of concern and should be concerned to the citizens. John's going to do it. He's going to explain it. It's here, John. You've seen it. And we're going to start by explaining to you how elections used to be run. So, John, over to you.
All right. Is this mic on?
This mic.
Use the headphone.
Yeah, you have to use this one for that. That's the end. And hold it close to your
Here?
Okay, there you go.
All right. So when I got to Colorado and I registered to vote, and I was in law school at DU, and I went in to cast my vote in my precinct. And the person who checked me in was one of my neighbors. And I had to show my driver's license. I didn't realize that I needed a driver's license at the precinct voting center, so I had to run back home and get my driver's license. And then I was signed in, and I cast my ballot, and it was put in a box. And a few years later, when I went to vote, it was still in the precinct, but I had to pull a lever on a machine after clicking several little toggles that were to cast my vote. So that's how elections used to be done. It was in person, on election day, with voter ID. So what do we want to say about that?
Well, we're going to see whether this will work.
So it was, there was human supervision over the process, and it was in the precinct, so it was actually fun. People knew each other, and they looked forward to election day because it was a day off because it was a holiday. And you were with your neighbors, and you felt like you were doing something important, voting. And it was easy to get volunteers. There was a list to be election judges and poll watchers, and it was quite an honor to be selected for that. Now it's very difficult to get volunteers because of the process.
And how were the votes counted in those days?
By hand.
And where were they counted?
In the precinct. And then they would phone up the totals to the county, and then the county would phone up the totals to the Secretary of State. And nobody would know who won until early the next morning.
And as it says on the slide, it's kind of hard to tamper with that. You'd have to tamper with all the precincts, I guess.
That's right. Because it was decentralized, if you wanted to try to rig an election, you'd have to do it in several precincts. And it would be very hard to pull off because you'd get caught.
But I guess Mayor Daley figured out how to do it.
Yes, he did.
Okay. Well, so how do we do it now, John?
Now, ballots are mailed to every registered voter. And
are they also registered to other people? I mean, mailed to other people? Are they also mailed to other? Well, I guess they're mailed to what's supposedly registered voters.
right.
Yeah.
So to give you an idea of how this is abused, on May 1st, there was a search done of the people in the Colorado voter registration list who had requested a permanent change of address, either because they were dead, their family requested it, or because they no longer lived at that address. So our team did a search of the ballot mailing list for the primary election. Over 100,000 ballots were mailed to people who had filed a permanent change of address. So what happens to those ballots? They're floating around on the floors of college dormitories, on the hallways of apartment houses, and anyone can scoop them up. And if you want to vote one of those ballots yourself, because you'd like to vote twice, you can get the signature of the person at that address off the internet and imitate it when you sign the ballot envelope.
Now, we're not saying that actually happened.
Oh,
we're
no.
not citing specific examples. We're just telling you about the system, right?
Right. And if any of you have seen 2,000 Mules, what happens to those fraudulent ballots that are cast by people voting twice or 3 times or whatever? Well, they're put into these ballot drop boxes. There's no election judge to verify the identity of the voter.
So to compare the old system with the new system, old system, you're there in person, you have to identify yourself. The people staffing the polling place, many of them may know you, some of them may know you, you may know them. They're sort of watching what you're doing. So, and you can't take the ballot out and say, well, I'm going to take it home and decide how to mark it, right, and bring it back next week.
That's correct.
You got to do it there and leave the ballot in the ballot box, or you just leave without voting. That's the old system. But now nobody sees who's filling out the ballot, and nobody sees how they return it. And we just trust. We trust, but do we verify?
We do not verify. So you all got a primary ballot, and you filled it out, and you took it to the polling center, or you put it in the mail. And you think that you voted, but you didn't, because what happened to that ballot is it was run through an enormous machine. So it was in an envelope, and you signed the envelope, and that envelope went through this enormous machine that does 100 of these in like 10 seconds. And the machine compares the signature on the ballot to a series of signatures that are on file for that name that's on your envelope. That electronic file is at the Secretary of State's office. So the signature on the envelope is compared to the signatures in the data files, and there's a certain degree of accuracy, and some counties set it at, will allow, if there's a 20% discrepancy, we'll let that go through, or if there's a 40% discrepancy, we'll let that go through.
So that's variable.
That's variable, and it's set by the counties. So then the ballot, when it comes out of the machine, is either accepted in the ballot envelope, or it's rejected and it goes over to adjudication. So what comes out of that machine is 2 stacks of envelopes with ballots in them. One stack goes to adjudication. The other stack goes to counting. Okay, so let's talk about adjudication first. So it goes over to adjudication, and the ballot is, first of all, the envelopes are, I'm sorry, we have to adjudicate the signature first. So there's a Democrat and a Republican election judge, but in most counties there aren't enough Republicans, so there's just a Democratic adjudication judge sitting at a computer screen. And she gets to look at the signatures that are on file and the signature on the ballot. Now remember that the policy is to count every vote. So the election judges, most of whom have Democratic county clerks and recorders, are reluctant to reject ballots based on the signature. So they're going to lean, they're going to be liberal in allowing the ballot to be counted, even if they think the signature looks a little odd. So once it's decided that that ballot can be counted, now it goes back into the counting file from the adjudication center. Then the envelope.
So let's stop there, John.
Right.
So to summarize, is it fair to say that ballots are in envelopes?
Yes.
And they come back in envelopes and if they don't have a signature on the envelope, well, then they can't be processed, or they're not supposed to be processed.
Right.
But if they have a signature, then they go through this examination that you described.
Yes.
And but no one has ever actually observed that voter putting his signature on that ballot, on that envelope.
That's 100% correct.
Okay. And unlike the old system where you didn't even need the signature, I mean, signatures went in the poll book, right? You
signed
in, you check in, and you sign in the poll book, I'm here to vote, and they give you a ballot. Now they just mail you a ballot, and somebody signs the envelope, and nobody really knows who signed it. I mean, that's the bottom line.
That's correct.
Without going into, excruciating detail, like we lawyers like to do. Well, all we're pointing out, Carol, is that there are vulnerabilities in the way ballots and ballot envelopes are processed and accepted. That's all we're saying, and we're contrasting it with the system where the individual actually has to show up and identify him or herself and then receive a ballot, and there are people watching. Okay? That's all we're saying. And we're not saying every ballot that comes through it hasn't been completed by the voter whose name is on the envelope. We're just explaining the problems with the system.
So, Carol,
can we move on, please?
well, I want to ask, Carol, is it
We're never going to get to the
I know, we'll get through. But do you have an Agilis machine in Pitkin County? So, am I correct that when the machine processes all the envelopes through, it only kicks out a certain percentage of the envelopes to be adjudicated manually, correct?
It doesn't kick them out. I mean, they process, they're just scanned into the system upstairs, and then they come downstairs for sig verification before they're ever open.
Right.
So,
But that isn't all of the envelopes. There are a lot of envelopes that go through and are authenticated, signatures are authenticated by the computer, not by human judges.
I don't think so in Pitkin County. It's too small.
That's different.
It's too small.
In Douglas, the machine
Well, they have thousands.
does the
They
preliminary
have
work.
thousands.
Right.
So let's
okay.
move on, John, because
All right. Thank you.
I think that everybody's committed. We're bringing dinner in at 6:30, so I'm sure you're all committed to stay here all
Yeah.
evening.
Next slide, please.
Yeah, voter registration system, John.
Okay, so basically in Colorado, they want to register everybody over 18. So if you apply for Medicaid and you're over 18, you're registered to vote. If you get a driver's license and you're over 18, you're registered to vote. That means you get a ballot. Doesn't mean you're a U.S. citizen. It doesn't mean that you're a resident of Colorado. You may be a California student at the University of Denver, Colorado, and you want to get a driver's license from Colorado, you're registered to vote in Colorado.
So in other words, it's very easy to register.
Right.
Well, the system is rigged, I shouldn't say rigged. The system is intentionally created to promote registration because that's the policy.
That's
Public
right.
policy is we want people to register so they'll be able to vote.
Right. So,
but what about removing registrations when they are no longer valid? Because people move to a different location. So if you live in Pitkin County and you move to Adams County, you're no longer eligible to vote on Pitkin County races, right? Or if you move out of state, you're no longer eligible to vote in Colorado at all. So what happens there?
well, you can file a change of address and ask to be removed from the voter registration rolls, but it's almost impossible to get that person off because Colorado belongs to a group of states that have the acronym ERIC, and I don't know what the acronym stands for, but anyway, 28 states signed an agreement that they'll share voter registration information. The idea was it'll keep people from voting twice, once in one state and one in another. And so the system is supposed to check for that. But what happens is Eric ends up in charge of our computerized voter registration rolls. They have the full roll. So a county clerk may remove a voter from the system because they respond to the voter's request, and Eric will put that same name back in the system the next day. So it's really hard to get people out of the voter registration system when they don't belong in it. And those ballots all get mailed. So who votes those ballots? Nobody knows.
Larry has a comment or question.
So a number of years ago, more than 10, I was actually on the City of Aspen Liquor Board, and I became a resident of Florida. And I went in to notify them that I can't be on the board anymore. I'm not a citizen of Aspen and nor a citizen of Colorado anymore. And basically did what you said in order to tell them that I wasn't going to be voting here anymore. And ever since then, I've been getting a ballot at every election.
And who votes your ballot?
Not Larry. Of course not. Well, we could give you many examples of the problems with the voter registration rolls. But the policy is definitely to get people on, and the policy is to make it hard to get them off, because we have a public policy in favor of supporting voting and making voting available. And I'm not ascribing any nefarious motives. You might, if you like, but I'm not going to ascribe any nefarious motives to those policies. But they do have the effect that the voter registration rolls are loaded with names of people who are not qualified to vote in Colorado or in their respective counties from time to time.
So if I could interrupt for just a second. So
No,
many
you're
of
not.
you will hear this debate usually it's between Democrats and Republicans over election integrity. The Democrat position is always about voter access. And we can't take anybody off the rolls because we want every eligible person to vote. So since the machines are going to sort out all the signatures, we'll leave it, and the adjudication judges, we can trust that system. It's better to have too many people in the system than not enough. That's the Democrat position. Their argument is always more access. The system will sort it out. The Republican position, the election integrity position, is we want a secure election process. We want it honest, we want it fair, and we want it transparent.
So, John, I'm going to differ with you a bit, because I'm not here to represent any political party position on anything. And I wouldn't claim that one party or the other is more interested in election integrity than the other, even though I have my personal views on it. I'm not here to promote that. We're just here to give you information about how the system works and where there may be vulnerabilities. There are vulnerabilities. It's not maybe, they are. And the next one that we're going to discuss is one that John has been really deeply involved in, because one of the first things he got involved with in election integrity in Colorado was problems with our computer voting systems. Now, I say computer voting systems. When you're processing those ballots, and you're an election judge, they're being processed by a computer. And if you know how your Windows operating system works on your PC at home, then you know a lot more than the average person using a PC knows. And that's about how much your county clerk knows about what goes on in the computer voting systems, and it's about how much your Secretary of State knows about it, and it's certainly a lot more than the average citizen knows, which is nothing. So let's explain what we know about the computer voting systems that are used in Colorado, John.
Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is what are the standards? What requirements are there for computers that count votes? Well, there's a publication, it's 2 volumes, about 2,000 pages total, called, and it's published by the Federal Election Commission in 2002. It's called the 2002 Voting System Standards. Those are the standards that apply to computers that count votes, which are now used in almost every state. And the standards are, it has to be, number 1, secure. It can't be hackable. Number 2, it has to be reliable. And number 3, it has to save all of the electronic records. Those are the 3 requirements for computer systems that count votes. Now, the computer systems that are used in Colorado are sold by 2 vendors. ClearVote, or Clear Ballot, is used in Douglas and Garfield counties. Dominion Voting Systems sells the systems or leases them to the other 62 Colorado counties. And do we want to talk about Mesa County now?
Let's just talk briefly about testing. So,
okay, testing, yes.
So just let me say a word about it, John. So because the systems are basically computers, and nobody knows what goes on inside them except the vendor, and the vendor has all kinds of contracts prohibiting anyone from knowing what goes on inside them, the state, the legislature, enacted statutes saying, well, so we can have some confidence that they're secure, reliable, and they retain the records, they must comply with these 2002 DSS standards. That's in the state statutes. That's a requirement. Another requirement is before they can be used, and there are new versions about every 18 months, before a new version can be used, it has to be tested and pass the test by a federally accredited testing laboratory. And that is done in Colorado under state statute. The only problem is the testing laboratory, well, 2 problems. One, the testing laboratory that's used wasn't accredited for 2 years. And we were still using a system that was partially tested during the period of unaccreditation. So state law has been violated. And even if it had been accredited, it wouldn't really matter because the testing doesn't really test for security, reliability, or retention of records. So end of that story.
Yeah, thank you.
Let's go into the next Mesa County.
Okay, so many of you have heard about what happened in Mesa County. So what happened is the Secretary of State in 2021 sent out a notice to all of the county clerks and recorders saying, we're going to come out and do a trusted build on your system. A trustware build is basically a software update. So what happens is the vendor, Dominion Voting Systems, had their software, their new software program tested by Pro V&V Labs. Pro V&V Labs gave it a thumbs up. Then the Secretary of State certified it. And then the Secretary of State made what is called the golden image. This is the software package that's going to be uploaded on all 62 Dominion systems. And so they notified the county clerk in Mesa County, Tina Peters, we're going to come out in May of 2021 and we're going to do the trusted build or software update on your system.
This happened in all the counties.
Yeah, in all the counties, but it happened in Mesa in May. So the clerk, Tina Peters, said, are you going to erase any of our election records when you install the new software? And the Secretary of State representative said, yes, that's part of what happens in the trusted build. We erase what's on the computer and then we put new stuff on, and that way if there's anything bad on the system, it's all gone. So Tina Peters...
What could be bad that would be on the system that they'd want to get rid of?
Well, you could have bugs or software that would...
Or could you have some records of how an election was processed?
Yeah, well, yes, you do. And what Tina Peters realized is that when they erased the records by installing new software, they were going to erase the records of the 2020 election. And
now hold on, John. Is there a requirement for retention period of election records?
yes,
What is it?
it's 25 months after an election under Colorado state law, and federal law requires the county clerk to preserve those records for 22 months after an election. It is a federal crime to erase election records before the 22 months has expired.
And had 22 months expired between November 3, 2020 and May 2021?
Good point, Maurice. No. So Tina Peters did not want to be guilty of committing a federal or state crime. And the Secretary of State had sent her an instruction saying, be sure to save all your election projects. Well, election projects are basically the vote totals. So they're not all the records of everything that happened in the election.
That's required to be retained.
That's
under law.
required by law to be retained. So what did she do? She said, I'm going to take a picture of what's on my system before the Secretary of State comes out and erases it and installs new software. So that's what she did. She hired a consultant. He came out and he took a picture of the system. He took a picture of the election management server and one of the scanners. The computer voting system is actually more than one computer. In Mesa County, it's 36 computers, but it has one that's called the server, and each one of these 36 computers has to have a separate thumb drive put in it and have the software installed for that particular machine. But she saved the election records that were totaled on the election server, which included pictures of the ballots that were cast in the 2020 election.
And the databases and other,
Yes, all of that.
all the data. There are lots of data involved. Pictures of all the data before the trusted build and then after the trusted build.
Correct.
Okay.
So what happened after that is the Secretary of State's office learned that there had been an image made of the Mesa County system. So on June 17th of 2021, the Secretary of State passed a new emergency rule banning the county clerks from allowing any consultant to touch the voting system. The only people under that rule who can touch a voting system are the county clerk or the election manager for the county, or the Secretary of State's representative, or a representative of the vendor, one of their software people.
Or an election judge.
No, or a voter casting a ballot.
Yes.
The election judges can't touch the system.
That's
Okay.
right. Sorry.
So now,
I was just testing it.
sure, county clerks are not allowed to hire a consultant to tell them if their gear works. Okay? So what happens after that is in August, this image that had been taken of the Mesa County voting system was put up on the internet. And
Two images. Before
two
and after.
images. Yeah, the before, I'm sorry, I left out part. After the trusted build was done, the consultant came back and took another picture of the system. So he had a before and an after. And then he put them up on the internet.
Well, we don't know who put them up on the internet.
I'm sorry, the consultant
It's
did not.
known. It is
It's not known who
It is
did.
not known who put
Yes,
them on the internet.
okay. So, computer white hat hackers from all over the country began looking at these images and analyzing
Well, what's
them.
a white hat hacker?
A white hat hacker is somebody who wants to do good by hacking into computer systems and then telling the operator of the system, I just hacked your system and you should fix it. Here's what you should do to repair it.
These were people who could do that, but they were not hacking into any computer system in this case, were they? They were
No.
simply downloading a copy of the before and after images and then analyzing them and applying their skills as so-called hackers to find issues.
Exactly.
Is that correct? Okay.
Yes.
I'm
Okay.
interrogating you.
All right. So then, what's the next thing that happened? Well, in October of 2015, the Secretary of State made these emergency rules permanent.
2021.
I'm sorry, 2021, made these rules permanent. So we filed a lawsuit in November challenging those rules and challenging the electronic computer system, the computer voting system, because we had proof that it didn't meet 2002 VSS standards. It wasn't secure, it could be hacked, it wasn't reliable because it didn't count votes properly, and it didn't retain the information. The two images from Mesa County showed that 29,000 files had been erased between the before and after images. And it turned out that the Dominion software program, which is supposed to keep a record of everything that happens in an election, only allows 20 megabytes for those files.
Well, for log files, it's called log files, and without going into detail, they're files that in which is recorded the history of what happens in the computer.
Right.
And these were set up with such small log file sizes that it was impossible to retain the information even if they hadn't wiped it out, but they wiped it out anyway.
Yeah, so let me make a comparison here. So you all know what happens when an airplane crashes and there are fatalities. The FAA comes out and they recover the black box. That black box has a record of everything that happened in that aircraft from the time the engines were turned on until the black box was taken out of the airplane. In other words, when the airplane's sitting at the bottom of the ocean and 6 months later they come out and find the wreck and get the black box, it's still recording information. Now, how does that compare to the software in the election system? The software in the election system, when it runs out of the 20 megabyte space, just overwrites the record of what was there.
And that happens.
Usually
within a matter of seconds.
Yeah.
After
During an election, that file is full within a few seconds. So what happened in the election can't be determined because the records are erased by the software itself.
And John, is that done for economy because
No,
it's very expensive to have larger hard drives?
No, the recommendation of the Federal Election Commission is to have 1,000 times 20 megabytes for your space. So they have reduced it by a factor of 1,000.
Oh, they're parsimonious.
Yes.
So John, in the interest of time, I'd like to move on to what did we learn from the Mesa County images, because you're involved and have been involved in actual and potential legal actions trying to get a declaration that these voting systems are illegal to use.
That's correct.
Not that you're against the use of any voting system that's reliable and meets the standards, but these just don't meet the standards and they shouldn't be used. And everybody in the state wants to ignore it, except you and me, I guess, and maybe Sharona back there and Chris. And
Yes.
Larry, okay, and Darren, okay, and yes, Rick.
If I can comment.
Sure, Rick, please.
I was very connected with these election systems back when Diebold owned them. I was on the board, and I was the board member who was assigned to oversee how these machines were put together, how they were programmed, and how they were used. And the problem we have, you're touching on now, you can make these secure, you can make them perform well, but you can't make them be immune to people who don't want to follow the law. So, you know, the same people that say, oh, you have to secure these things, and once you have a secure certificate, you cannot make any changes. If there's a bug in the software, then go back to manual. You cannot add a new copy of the system unless you put it through the entire certification process again. But they ignore that. So if they can ignore that, they can ignore manual procedures as well. And so the question really comes down to, what do you do about the people who don't care what the law is? The machines, you know, receive all the culpability, but the machines are just machines. The people who sit on top of them are the ones that not only define the processes, but who are not accountable if they change them ad hoc. So that's really the issue that you're dealing with these.
Well, let me address that, Rick. You know, There are many ways to address it. Under the old system that was described, where you go in and you know everybody's people and it's paper and so forth, yes, it can be gamed. Yes, it can be gamed. But at least the voters understand, because they can see what's happening. Now, maybe it's a shell game, okay? Maybe sometimes it's a shell game, and what's going on is not what they see, and vice versa. But people can have some confidence that, okay, I went in, I was given a ballot, you know, I marked it myself, and I put it in the ballot box, and there's a Republican and Democrat doing each of the jobs, and people can have some confidence. The problem I have with using these electronic systems is it's hard for people to have real confidence in them because they cannot see what's happening. They can't even see the shell game. The shell game is going on, you know, totally invisibly within the machine. So we talked about, you know, we don't have a lot of time here. We could go on for hours, but our election system is like a battleship to me. Okay, that's my analogy. And it has compartments. You know, it's got the registration system, it's got the database, it's got the ballot design, which we haven't talked about. It's got the system for distributing the ballots, it's got the system for receiving the ballots, the system for processing the ballots, the system for all these systems. And there's a lot of vulnerability in many elements. As lawyers, it's very hard to find compartments in the battleship that you can undermine. And when I say undermine, I mean for good purposes. I mean to try to get corrected, to try to drive out some corruption. There are many legal barriers, again, that prevent cleaning up the registration system. I mean, we could spend hours just on that. It's extremely difficult legally to clean up the registration system, but it's desperately needed. And there are many legal barriers against cleaning up other elements. But the electronic voting systems are vulnerable because it can be demonstrated objectively that they don't comply with law.
Okay,
so that's why we're talking
it.
about this. Okay?
There's a case in Georgia that began in 2017. It's called Curling versus Raffensperger. It was brought by a group of citizens, including Marilyn Marks, a former resident of Aspen, who is, in the last 10 years, the only voter to successfully sue the Colorado Secretary of State. And but anyway, in Georgia, they had an Obama-appointed judge, and the citizens sued because the entire election voting system was stored at Kennesaw State University. And white hat hackers got into the system and wrote the Secretary of State and the university president a letter saying, we just got into your system and you need to fix it. It's not secure. And 6 months later, they did it again and wrote another letter. And the Secretary of State and the college did nothing. So they filed their lawsuit. The judge in the case was very skeptical and said, you know, you're making a lot of claims here. Let me see it. So they called their expert, a guy named Alex Halderman from the University of Michigan, who's a computer science expert. He's the #1 expert in the country on electronic voting systems. Halderman took a voting machine, put in votes, saw the totals come up on the screen.
In the courtroom.
In the courtroom. And then he went to the other side of the room and with his telephone switched the votes with his cell phone. And the judge said, okay, you got my attention. You guys got to fix that system. That's a true story. And that case is still going on. Go ahead.
Okay, so let's go back now with very little time left before we take some questions.
I don't know. I haven't spoken to him.
Okay, so before we go to open questions, let's go through what was found, not what we found, but what was found in the Mason County server images comparing the before and after trusted build images.
Okay, the first thing they found is that records were erased and that the system erases records. So it doesn't meet the requirement of 2002 VSS that it has to retain records. The second thing that they found is the system is not secure. It had an open port, which is an access point in the computer where it's open to the internet. it was open to the entire internet. There was no password security on that port, and there was no firewall security on that port.
Well, not only that, no, there was no firewall in the whole system. So this is kind of amazing, but I've seen the settings, okay? And I've seen the firewall settings, and when you set up a firewall on a computer, there are options available. And you can set it to accept connections from certain IP addresses, that's Internet Protocol IP addresses. You can set it not to connect with any IP addresses, don't let any of them in, or any IP address. This one was set for any IP address. Now somebody intentionally, that's not the default when you install a firewall, that's not the default. So somebody intentionally set the firewall on that system so that any computer in the world that could find the IP address of that server could access that server. And how hard is it to find the IP addresses of the servers in Mason County or any county?
An 8th grader can do it with I forget the name of it. There's a computer program that can find the IP address of every computer
And
in
there are
every
sites
county
on the
voting
internet
system.
itself that can
Yes.
find it for you. So, and Rick is nodding affirmatively because he knows all about that. So this was wide open, no firewall essentially.
Right. And the last thing they found was that the system was not reliable. They found that in counting the votes for the last 2 elections, November 2020 and April 2021 in the municipal election, there were databases created that were not in the Dominion manual. And they could not explain why 5,800 ballots were counted in the first database and not counted in the second database.
So in effect, so in the system, there's a database that just tells you, what batches of ballots were counted, when they were counted, how many ballots were in the batch, and so forth. And then there's just like an electronic spreadsheet. It's called the main database, and it's just vote totals. So it's got Joe got 3 votes, Mary got 5 votes, and every time the system scans the image of a ballot, and it thinks it sees a vote on there for Mary, it adds 1 vote to the main database. There's no tracing of those votes back to the databases or to the ballot images, so there's no way to audit them. And what they found in 2 consecutive elections in Mesa County was that an extra set of databases mysteriously appeared in the middle of the county that did not include all of the records from the first databases, the records for the 5,800 ballots. And so it is impossible to be sure that the main database contains the actual count from the election. Now that's what's inside these systems. And you didn't know it, and I didn't know it until I learned about it here. It troubles me. I think it ought to trouble most people. But that's what was found.
All right, so what we know is, from examining the Mesa County system, that it does not meet the federal standards for voting systems. And by law, that you're required to meet that standard in every county in Colorado.
So John, I'm sorry.
What else is true? That the Secretary of State admits that the system in Mesa County is identical to the software systems in every other Dominion county. It's the same in Pitkin County. So your voting system doesn't meet federal and state law requirements. Now, what can be done about it?
The Secretary of State admitted that in Elbert County, right?
Yeah, she admitted that the systems are identical. So if it's wrong in Mesa, it's wrong here, it's wrong in Denver, it's wrong in El Paso, and so on. Now, has any court allowed any evidence to be presented about these computer voting systems? What do you think? No. Every single case that was filed with those allegations was dismissed. Go ahead.
So let's talk about lawsuits to watch, because we're going to run out. We probably already ran out of time. But
Yeah,
tell us about some lawsuits.
Okay, so there's a suit that I'm counsel in Denver, which deals with the Secretary of State's rules in Colorado. There's the Curley case in Georgia, which is coming close to a conclusion, and the plaintiff's lawyers are pretty sure they're going to win because they won all the way through up to now. And then there's the Lake versus Hobbs case in Arizona, where Kerry Lake, who's running for governor as a Republican, has sued the current Secretary of State, alleging that the voting systems shouldn't be used in the fall to count the votes. And that case is being heard now in federal, actually today, the motion for preliminary injunction is being heard in the U.S. District Court in Arizona.
And I've been checking my messages because we're supposed to get a report on it, but I don't have one yet, so I can't give you an update. I'm sorry.
Okay.
And so also I think we should make sure we mention that just in the last couple of days we have been able to obtain the commitment of the lawyer, the only lawyer who successfully sued the Colorado Secretary of State to work on these legal matters with us.
That's true. Rob McGuire, I've been trying to, since November, I read a decision, I read Rob McGuire's, the opinion in his case. He represented Marilyn Marks. And I was trying to get Rob interested in this, and I couldn't. He represents Marilyn Marks in the curling case in Georgia, and he's really, really busy. But he is the national expert on computer election voting systems. And he's a top flight lawyer, but he's really, really busy.
Despite the fact he went to Yale Law School.
Yeah, so he's agreed to help us bring these cases in Colorado. And it's wonderful to have him as part of the team. I wish he could have been here, but
So
too busy.
what should be done from a lawyer's point of view?
okay, so what
We had a very narrow point of view.
What we are trying to do is get an injunction from a court, which is an order telling the Secretary of State, fix the voter registration system. Get all the unqualified voters out of the system. And the second thing we're trying to do is get an injunction telling the Secretary of State, don't use any more computer voting systems that don't meet our federal and state standards.
And so, like the punchline.
If I could just give one final comment on that. I would agree that given the lack of accountability as to how these things are used, I don't think any computer voting system should be used. You can't.
Well, Rick, people have asked me, can they ever be made secure? And I've said no, for the reasons that you state. They theoretically can, but you can't ever be sure that they are.
Well, they can be made secure from hacking, not 100%, but 99.99%.
Right.
You can have the right kind of verification that the software works in the right way, as long as you don't change it. But when you have people above it that are not willing to abide by the processes that would be important for them to be reliable, then you can't use them. You just can't use them because you can't count on the whole system of people that sit above them. So they really can't be used because the point you haven't made is that these things are replicated all over the place. So whereas you have individual precincts that may be using manual systems and each one would have bad people in it, to subvert the process. With these computer systems, they can spread like wildfire across the country.
Exactly.
And so the multiplier on the bad behavior is enormous.
Right, huge leverage. Something that, just 1 second, David, and then, something we did not emphasize today because, the time doesn't permit us to go into detail, and there's so much to this. But the Secretary of State in Colorado has been on a constant campaign to centralize more and more decision-making and control over our election system, which is antithetical to an honest voting system. Because just like the leverage, if you have the same system used in 100,000 counties, you can leverage that into cheating in 100,000 counties. But if it's dispersed and people are doing it, it's much harder. But she's doing the opposite. She is concentrating all the control in her office in Denver, even to the point where in recent legislation, you're probably unaware of this, but the the election results in your county are supposed to be certified by what's called a canvass board in your county. And it used to be that like the chair of your Republican Party and chair of your Democrat Party and your county clerk would have to meet and all agree that the results were kosher, okay? And then they could be sent in to the Secretary of State. These are the certified results. Our legislature just passed a law that our Secretary of State demanded they pass, saying she can override the canvass boards. So the canvass boards have no authority anymore, as an example of the centralization. So David Kudish. Yes, David.
What party is this young lady from?
The
Secretary of State.
Well, I believe she's a Democrat. Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. But you know what? I just don't trust politicians personally. It's not a party thing. I've said it before. I'll say it again. And I'm confident that if Republicans get control of everything, that you'll have the same damn problem. So it's not a party thing. I'm sorry. This gentleman back here has been patiently waiting to.
Thank you. Thank you for taking your time.
Yes.
I think all phases of our lives are controlled by computers now. To be realistic, to go back to the hand counting system exclusively, I don't know how realistic that is with 330 million people. Yes, I know. It would be very interesting. I would not be against it. However, I'd like to make another comment. The gentleman here said that the Democrats would like to register and vote everybody possible, where the Republicans aren't alike in that situation. However, what you should also trumpet and talk about is the inability in certain counties in this country, and you know them very well, in certain states, where it's very difficult to vote, where there's one drop box for 1,700 square miles, where people wait online for hours to vote. I've been very privileged. I've never had to wait long to vote. I know the old system where you sign, that's very good, and I get a paper ballot here mailed to me because I requested it. I'm not always here in residence. But you should also, besides talking about the systems, talk about the ability of people to vote. And one other thing, yes, there are problems of vote where people vote in two places. And a very prominent person who did that was Mr. Mark Meadows at one point. So I'm glad you didn't put the onus on one persuasion or the other, independents, Democrats, or Republicans. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments. And unfortunately, we had very limited time today, and we had a very specific agenda, and the agenda is the Colorado election system and voting systems in particular. And the fact that we didn't address every conceivable election system issue doesn't mean that there aren't other issues that should be addressed. We're explaining to you what we've been working on and what we've learned. We've taken deep dives, and we've got lots of information that would be important, I think, to citizens that we want to share. And we're happy to share any information we have that's helpful, and thank you very much for your comments. Any other questions or comments? Darren.
So Colorado has 64 counties.
Yes.
Currently, 2 counties use the clear ballot system.
Yes.
Douglas County and Garfield County.
Yes.
And then there are 2 other counties that hand count the ballots because the counties are too small.
Yes.
Okay, so at this point in the game, when we start to look at the motivations of the people for what it is that they're doing, in particular the Secretary of State's office, what kind of efforts are you engaged in try to uncover the purposes for some of this rather extraordinary legislation that's coming down the pike? I mean, the Secretary of State, anybody that's got a 5-year-old education can look it up on the internet and figure out that this gal was a salsa dancer. She taught salsa dancing before she somehow became the Secretary of State nominee. Now, that's a true story.
Well, that's a real skill, actually.
Right,
I
okay.
can't do it.
So the point is that we see a pattern, a succession of efforts being made, starting with our state government, to put these kind of people in place, put this kind of legislation in place, and make it more and more onerous to be able to clean up our election system. The systems are at least the Dominion side of the thing, are inherently flawed. Garfield County recognized that the minute it was brought in for our testing and we kicked it out. But that's not the case for the rest of the
Right.
state.
All right. So Darren, let me give you my response, and John, you can give your response. So I have my own views about what the motives might be, and I'm a really cynical person, so I got really cynical views. But in this effort, I've tried to discipline myself just to be a lawyer about it, and say, what couldn't we do with the tools we have? Because it doesn't, I don't think it's not productive for me, and I don't have the time or energy anymore to fight on 1,000 different fronts. So I've tried to pick fronts, legal fronts, where I think like the battleship. See, okay, I'm looking for the compartments that I can penetrate with a torpedo. Okay, the weakest compartments to get this started. And motives are irrelevant to me. I'm looking at in that context. Okay, because I'm sure this is a big problem, but I'm not going to help solve the problem unless I can penetrate one of those compartments. So I'm just kind of laser focused on that. And I hope you don't think I'm ducking your question, but that's really how I've tried to approach it, Darren. John?
Well, I think we're almost finished, and I want to thank all of you for coming, and those of you who personally came up and shook hands and introduced yourselves, including Rabbi Mintz.
Yes,
We'll get to it.
Yes.
But
No?
I want to thank you, and because it's been a great pleasure to come back to Aspen again. It's such a beautiful place, and I had never seen this building, and it's gorgeous. You're very lucky to have it.
Here, Melanie.
So it's been suggested that any use of machines is difficult. Any use of machines is not a good idea. We have examples around the world, countries like Germany and Israel, where they hold elections. In Israel's case, I think they've had 5 in the last several years. They have people voting. Everyone has to have ID. They vote by hand. They're counted by hand, and the results are available that night. So for the United States to do that, what would that take? Is it even possible? Sorry? Take more Jews?
Take more Jews.
In Germany, they're doing it too.
John, do you want to address that?
Sure.
So John will address that.
You have to change the law to get that to happen. So, and that's personally what I am advocating for. And I got the Republican Party to adopt it as part of their platform. Vote in person with ID on election day, unless you're disabled or you're active duty military. And then you should have your signature witnessed by somebody who can be identified. So, there's a slide up, and it's what do we got to do now to make a dent in the system. If we can win a case get an injunction against use of the machines, it's a huge victory, because then they've got a hand count. That's the only alternative. And if you can get a case cleaning up the voter rolls, you can get that decision, then you force them to re-legislate the election system. And that's our goal. And to do that, you've got to have competent, experienced election integrity lawyers. That's not me, but it is Rob McGuire. And I work for 1/4 of my regular rate, so that I told Judy, I'm going to take these cases. Do you mind eating beans? She said no. So, but Rob can't, because I've got retirement income. He doesn't. He's got a family to support. So we need financial resources to support it. And then we can't quit. Never quit. So that's what I have to say, and
So
thanks for coming.
I'll take your question in a second. A footnote on the hand counting. So I've been in touch with a number of counties, smaller counties, admittedly in Colorado, where activists have been pushing their commissioners and their clerks. We need just to do hand counts of paper ballots and the heck with the machines and so forth. And often the clerks push back and say, I can't get enough people to do the counting. And one of the responses is, well, of course you can't, because you have pushed people out of the process to the point where nobody wants to do anything. I mean, being an election judge now, it's a headache. We have early voting for how many days? And in Pitkin County, you've been election judges, you get assigned out to the firehouse at Aspen Village, and you sit there all day, and one voter comes in because you've got early voting, but you've got to have election judges there for every station. It's ridiculous. So people don't even want to step up and be election judges because of the burden of early voting, and then they're not given anything responsible to do in counting the ballots. But if you change the system so that the citizens are counting the results, they're involved. It's the citizens' election again. It is hoped that citizens would step up and say, heck yes, I'll do that. Now, we don't know till we try. I mean, this is all hypothetical, Melanie, until we try. But what you would get under a different system is almost, it's imaginary. You don't know. It's like, people can say it won't work. You can say it will work. You don't know till you try it. Yes.
So it seems as though my understanding of the situation with Tina Peters, she didn't go seeking this situation, but as her role there, and she was following what she felt were her responsibilities, and there's been extreme resistance that seems to be on the verge of corruption, resisting her efforts to get integrity in the election system. And so how do we deal with that? Am I correct thinking that there's corruption going on with this?
Well, let me give a comment on it, and then John, whatever. People generally don't know that Tina has been indicted for two things. One is helping the white hat hacker who made the images obtain identification credentials so you could get in and make the images, and of the related charge of, quote, influencing a public official to get it done. These are extremely minor offenses. She has not been charged with any offense relating to the actual imaging because it was not an offense. I mean, not even the, I will call him corrupt, DA in Mesa County could, with a straight face, try to bring an indictment for her imaging or having someone image the hard drives because it would just be laughable and would be so easily knocked down. So she's been charged with two minor offenses and she's been harassed. I just saw a note today, maybe they've arrested her again for jumping bail allegedly. Because, she's a celebrity now, so she goes to Vegas to speak and she goes here. So they have her under tight restrictions. You can't leave the state and so forth. I don't know what's happening today, whether she's been arrested again. But to me, it's a huge overreaction to really what winds up being very minor indictment. I read the indictment, and it's not a normal indictment. I'm sorry? Yeah, well, in a normal indictment, it says you're being charged with this, violating this criminal provision, and here are the facts supporting that. And then you're being charged with violating this criminal provision, and here are the facts supporting it. Not in this indictment. It says you're being charged with, I think, 2 or 3 counts relating to this identification thing, and then 2 or 3 counts relating to influencing a public official, which, by the way, are criminal statutes intended for bribing people, okay? For like going to your county commissioner, here, I'll give you $1,000 if you'll approve my application. It's not designed for this kind of thing. And then there's a long recitation of bullshit, okay? Of alleged facts with no attribution to any witnesses alleging that these things happened. And you can't read that indictment and say, well, it was this alleged fact that supports this claim. So to me, it's a bullshit indictment, and it's harassment. It is harassment. And I just say that from a lawyer's point of view, because, a lawyer thinks in terms of, well, what's the law? Okay, show me the provision. Okay, now show me the facts that you think support it. If they're there, they're there. I mean, I'm a personal friend of Tina's, and if she is guilty of some criminal acts, I guess she ought to pay the price. But you can't tell it from that indictment. Okay, I'm at the end of my speech on that. Sorry, John.
Well, I concur with Maurice's opinion of the indictment, and I support Tina Peters' resistance to government efforts to silence her. And I think we all owe it to our country to stand up, or we're going to get blown away.
maybe I could be a little more direct on my question. It seems like the Secretary of State is being corrupt, and she's actually the corrupt one compared to what she's accusing Tina Peters of doing.
Yes, absolutely true. It's the Secretary of State who should be under indictment, in my opinion. So, lady back here.
I'm just a dumb country doctor. Okay.
Alan, this lady behind you had her hand up, so.
Yes, we do have some breaking news real quickly that
Okay.
totally applies to it.
Breaking news, I'm sorry. You have
Yeah,
what?
breaking news, which I can interject it right now.
Tell
Yeah,
her.
wait. Let the lady ask her question because she's impatient.
This is a simple question.
I just wondered if you have any room for volunteers in your resources for a retired attorney who would work for free?
Oh, yes. Come see us.
Okay.
My quick statement was, this Tina person was told that we're going to update the machine. And she said, if you update the machine, don't we lose the past records? And they said yes. So she copied what was on the machine before. What's the crime? I don't get it.
Well, but this is why I say that the criminal indictment is not for that, okay? So it's sort of like the Soviets saying, show me the person, I'll show you the crime. That's what happened here. Show me the county clerk, I'll show you the crime. Not only was she told that we'll be deleting records, there's a state law that requires her to retain the record. Not just to retain them, but I mean, she personally, because she is the custodian of the records. So it's beyond the general retention requirement that John referred to, but it's her personal responsibility at pain of criminal penalty if she takes action to violate that. So as John said, she's trying to avoid, I don't know, I can't read her mind, but let's just assume, first of all, it's up to the state to prove that she did it for illegal reasons, or mens rea, as they say, an evil mind. They haven't proved that, so, Darren?
So there's a whole backstory to this whole thing. Tina, again, you're personal friends with her. Becky and I have been friends with her for a long, long time. In fact, I'm the guy that convinced her to run for the clerk and recorder's office instead of the treasurer. The point is that as soon as Tina announced that she was running for clerk and recorder, and she's kind of a clean it up, no bullshit kind of gal, right? She's a very avid supporter, go America kind of thing. That immediately drew the ire of the Secretary of State. And throughout Tina's election, to where she won and became the clerk and recorder, and immediately thereafter, there was a state-sponsored effort to remove Tina Peters from the clerk and recorder's office by a recall supported by the Secretary of State, so much so that they actually put an advocate for the state. They called her a consultant. She was quite frankly, the treasurer for Eagle County, Teak, down in Tina's office to disturb and turn the whole world upside down on the next following election, including messing with the computer systems. She was allegedly allowed, this Teak, to be able to plug in software and make adjustments in the computer. So here's somebody who's fairly new in the clerk and recorder's office, already drawing the ire of the Secretary of State, and it's just manifested from there. So I'm not the least bit surprised that we're talking about all this stuff. And to me, it just seems like, the tail wagging the dog. The problem sits at their state, and the problem will never get solved until we put, bright light of examination on our elected officials, and particularly in the Secretary of State's office.
Thank you, Darren. So, yes, we need to wrap this up. Sharona Bishop has an update on some Tina developments. So, Sharona, what do we have?
Well, to just say yes and amen to what Darren just said from day one, it has been an unbelievable witch hunt. And right now, as we're sitting in here, the district attorney's office has decided another felony is up because as a candidate and who's wanting a recount of the election, which Clerk Peters decided she wanted a recount of the election. We have no confidence in the election that just happened, and she has that right as a candidate. The state statute requires that she reach out to the counties. She reached out to the Secretary of State's office first, was given a ridiculous number, and then cost-wise for the recount, and then reached out to the clerks to let them know she was requesting a recount. Well, one of those clerks' addresses is for Mesa County. According to the measure in her bond, it states she's to have no contact with Mesa County election office, or excuse me, it says anyone in the office. And because an email was sent to the office letting them know she was seeking a recount, it's a generic email that went out to all clerks in Colorado. I think only 2 clerks went on there. They have decided that means she was contacting the office and has now had her bond revoked, and they are seeking another felony charge. You tell me if that is fair. Tell me if that is the spirit of the law.
So do we have any further questions, because we got to wrap it up? If not, I want to thank everybody. I want to thank especially Larry Winterman and Alan Altman, who put these together. And I think Larry actually sprang for some money to put some ads in the paper on his own initiative, and thank you very much for that, Larry. Thanks again to Inga and to Rabbi Mintz and to all of you for coming. If you have any other questions you want to ask us privately, please come up and do so afterwards. Again, thanks for coming.